right. The AARC is a group of very educated professionals who have studied the Kennedy assassination for decades. And the AARC is currently leading the efforts to try to get the remaining JFK assassination records released. And we've been hard at work at this for several years now. The situation is that in 1992, Congress passed the JFK Act. This is in the wake of Oliver Stone's movie, JFK. And a unanimous Congress decreed that it was a matter of utmost importance to the country for the people of the United States to have access, prompt access, to all of the information pertaining to the Kennedy assassination. As a result of that act, there were some 5 million pages placed in the National Archives. However, a very significant portion remains withheld to this date, more than 50 years after President Kennedy was shot and approaching 50 years after the issuance of the Warren Report. What we know about what is being withheld is that there are at least 1,100 documents entirely withheld by the National Archives at the behest of the CIA. Neither NARA nor the CIA has so far, despite pressures from me and my organization and others in the community of people interested in this subject, neither NARA or the CIA has been able to give a figure as to how many pages of documents this represents. Indeed, there is some discrepancy between the number of documents claimed to be withheld in their entirety. The CIA initially came forward with the figure of 1,100 in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit in which I represented journalist Jefferson Morley. Subsequently, the National Archives has suggested that the figure is 1,170, not 1,100. Whatever the number of pages is not known. The only thing that can be said is that in the course of that lawsuit, we succeeded in getting the CIA to examine, I think it was 13 documents, and they declared that there were something like 1,100 pages in those 13 documents. So extrapolating, you could say that there were tens of thousands of documents that are still withheld in their entireties. We don't know that. That's an extrapolation. What I suspect, on the basis of some examination of internal records of the Assassination Records Review Board, the organization that was set up by Congress to implement the JFK Act, is that the figure is probably somewhere between 30 and 50,000 pages. This also does not take into account the fact that many of the hundreds of thousands of CIA records and records from other agencies that were released in partially redacted form, and that although the review board set postponement dates basically all of those postponement dates passed certainly by 2007. In fact, I think nearly all of them by 2004. But the National Archives continues to withhold many to the redacted portions of many other documents. So we're talking about a very significant withholding of Kennedy assassination records more than 50 years after the fact, and long after Congress unanimously decreed that they should be promptly disclosed to the American public. The context in which this has occurred has been outrageous. In 2009, President Barack Obama, who you will remember is the president who on the day he was inaugurated proclaimed, or the day after, proclaimed that the Freedom of Information Act should be given priority. In 2009, he enacted a new executive order and established a national declassification center, which was supposed to declassify 400 million pages of historical records by the end of 2013. In 2010, 2011, I began to press the case in the public fora that were held by the National Declassification Center to demand that the JFK assassination records be expedited, their release be expedited, as they were certainly among the most important, if not the most important, historical records that were still not disclosed to the public. The National Archives rejected the request that I and other prominent citizens made, including requests signed by Professor G. Robert Blakey, who had been the general counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The National Archives rejected those requests, proclaiming that we would have to wait until 2017 to find out what is in those remaining withheld records. They also, the authorities, the CIA, the National Archives, and the National Declassification Center have also suggested that those records were not of particularly great importance, despite the fact that they include records on E. Howard Hunt, on the Soviet defector Nosenko, who came to the United States and testified in secret before the Warren Commission, and many other subjects of great interest to political assassination researchers. The importance of getting these records out, it has become magnified, in my view, by a couple of developments. One is that we now know that the investigation conducted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations was subverted by an agency that itself was under investigation in connection to the assassination of President Kennedy. That was the CIA. The CIA brought out of retirement a former CIA case officer to handle inquiries that the House Select Committee was making regarding the relationship between Lee Harvey Oswald and the DRE, a human exile organization that was funded by the CIA and managed by the CIA. They brought that case officer out of retirement to handle the HSCA's inquiries. The HSCA was never told by that case officer or by the CIA that the case officer that was acting as liaison with them was the very guy who had been in charge of the DRE at the time Oswald contacted it prior to the assassination of President Kennedy.
They can't hear you, Jim.
The CIA also did not inform the House Select Committee to the assassination of President Kennedy was corrupted by an agency that itself was under investigation. That demands accountability. Oversight by congressional committees is the hallmark of democratic accountability. If you don't have it, you don't have democratic accountability. That same principle has also been very recently brought to the forefront by the fact that Dianne Feinstein has charged that the CIA did the same thing with respect to the allegations of torture made by it against the Senate Committee on Intelligence. It is important to get these issues out and to get new oversight investigations into both the performance of the JFK Act and the implementation of the JFK Act, and the question of why the CIA engaged in conduct misleading the Congress of the United States about the investigation into a president of the assassination of a president of the United States. So I would urge all of you to join in this effort. 50 years of secrecy is enough, and we need to get these issues resolved and to the forefront. This is an issue which cuts across all political lines in this country. There is broad-scale public support. In the 80s and 90% of the American people do not believe the official Warren report. It cuts across all lines, Republican, Democratic, or Independent, but we have not yet been able to get Congress to take action or any other agency of government to take the action that is required by the facts that are now known. Thank you.
The Archive Center was organized in 1984, and of the almost 5 million documents on the Kennedy assassination that have been released so far, the AARC has been responsible for almost 1 million of them. Jim is the president of the organization, and Randy and I are board members. Jim will be speaking later about the problems of getting the last 1,100 documents, or this is an old version, 1,100 documents released from the National Archives, which have been withheld mostly by the CIA and were supposed to have been released a long time ago. So he's been working on that, and we haven't been able to get NARA to agree to this. Jim will be speaking later about the problems and he's going to talk about the urgent necessity of arousing public pressure on NASA to secure the release of the documents. First, it looks to me like there are a lot of people in this room. A couple have stopped by the table outside, and there are a lot of people in this room that appear to be somewhat familiar with it. Would you raise your hand if you have read lots of books or written books and are aware, so I can see? Because, okay, so thank you. This is not the typical audience that Randy has developed the data for, because he has approached it in a strictly mathematical and scientific fashion. And it's quite different than any of the speculative or theoretical pieces that people have written about him. Dr. Randolph Robinson is called Randy, and he's a diagnostic radiologist and the only non-government radiologist who was given permission by the Kennedy family to study the original autopsy materials.
Right.
Since then, he's spent more than 20 years thinking about it and researching the physical aspects of the Dealey Plaza events. There are many hundreds of researchers and academics and scholars, writers, journalists, and investigative reporters who have pored over original records and documents and scoured the literature and the archives for data on the Dealey Plaza shooting. But Randy's the first person to have analyzed the evidence mathematically. He passed every shred of that evidence through a screen of simple scientific criteria. Number one is the speed of sound. Number two is the speed of the bullets used by Mannlicher Carcanos, and this speed was determined by the experts at Edgewood Arsenal. Number three is the distance between the shooter and his target, and the shooter and Mr. Zapruder's camera, and the shooter and the microphone on the motorcycle driven by Officer McLean of the Dallas Police Department. These basic calculations enabled Randy to be the first and so far only person to synchronize the two pieces of irrefutable original evidence, the Zapruder film and the acoustic tape of the gunshots in Dealey Plaza. Ever since the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which is referred to usually as HSCA, acquired that tape, there have been flurries of speculation that the tape wasn't really recorded in Dealey Plaza, or that it was recorded at a specific other time, or the same day at a different time. Serious attempts have been made to prove that Officer McLean was elsewhere when the shots were taken. None of these speculations held up. Randy has not only found visual evidence of Officer McLean's motorcycle on the Zapruder film, but he's also corroborated mathematically and proved that the tape on McLean's motorcycle was recording the 5 shots taken at President Kennedy. As a result, he has now accomplished the only successful and mathematically provable synchronization of the Dealey Plaza audio tape recorded on Officer McLean's motorcycle with the Zapruder film. He's produced a virtual soundtrack for the silent Zapruder frame, which provides corroborated proof of the events in Dealey Plaza. And Doc, he's not a conspiracy theorist. He's a scientist and has used only data that can be proven scientifically. He has no political or personal agendas or goals. He has no preconceived conclusions. He has worked with proofed data and used them only when they provide visual and acoustic cross corroborations. That means it needs to be heard on the tape and seen on the film. Randy and I agree that the X-rays have not been altered or forged, that the president's body was not secretly altered, that the Zapruder frames were not manufactured to replace frames deliberately removed. This is close to being provable, because if someone at any government agency had done so, they had to have accidentally manufactured a complex covert plot to plant evidence that proves that there were 5 shots taken from 3 sites in Dealey Plaza and murdered President Kennedy. Randy?
Okay, thank you. Well, they've told you who I am. I'm going to run 2 short videos here before I really start. One actually will have the sequence of the virtual soundtrack. Another one will be related to CBS News. And just as a quick background for one of these videos is that CBS News in 1975 commissioned the ITEC Corporation to do a study, quantify the motion seen on the Zapruder film. Now it's interesting because ITEC was a CIA contractor. They developed spy satellites and did photo reconnaissance work. They were entrusted by CBS to provide a study of the film, And for nearly 40 years, CBS has known that there was a conspiracy, or should have known very easily. I'll start with these 2 short videos, and then I will discuss the synchronization process.
Want me to douse the lights?
Yeah, that may be helpful. Thank you. And a lot of this will deal with involuntary and voluntary reactions, the times of which are well known. You'll get a second chance to see this at the end of the presentation. She quickly snapped her head to the right upon hearing a sound. This is before he was struck, 1 frame before, and then after as he emerges behind the sign, when he's already in the process of grabbing for his wounded throat. You can see the change in his demeanor and the position of his arms.
Talk up a little.
Pardon?
Talk up a little louder.
Okay. Here's Conley. His right hand moves upwards involuntarily as his chest is struck. This is an indirect response. It's not hit by a bullet, but it causes him to go up like this. Impact from the back with the hand going up. And then he voluntarily starts bringing his wounded arm down to his side. There's the voluntary component. The first is involuntary, then voluntary. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah.
No, a little louder.
Okay, I'll speak up.
Get the microphone there.
Yeah. But there's 2 motions of the head, which has been well known for many, and this was actually documented and quantified by the ITEC Corporation. The 2 shots to the head were so close apart that
So close together.
so close together that they would have been virtually indistinguishable from. And what I've done is, the only way I can think of is to put the microphone on Zapruder's camera, because if it had a microphone, this is exactly what we would be analyzing today to say what happened back then. And you can see down and then back, and this is the backward motion. This will destroy the single bullet theory.
Right.
If you watch his wrist, Conley's wrist was not hit at the time Arlen Specter would love you to believe, but actually later from a fragment of the headshot. Watch how rapidly his right wrist goes forwards after that wound. That is roughly half a second between the first image and the second image.
Ooh.
And that is an involuntary reaction. He is not responding to any stimuli, it's just a bullet. Now the final shot, we'll see this phenomenon. I'll demonstrate it many times or several times today. The windshield having been struck at 2 different times, causing reflections of sunlight back to Zapruder's camera. There was a dent in the chrome windshield frame, which will accommodate the nose of a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano bullet. There you see the flash there. It is struck at 328 and it starts to flare at 329 and will continue for about 3 frames. And this is the virtual soundtrack. The 3 first reactions you'll see are Rosemary Willis, hearing the backfire, Kennedy reacting, Conley reacting, involuntary of Kennedy's head back and forth, and the flash of the windshield as it is struck. You'll see the synchronization here between the events and what. You see the synchronization on that flash? You see the light, and the sound travels a little bit slower, but and And this is all mathematical. I did not make this up. This is from all of the data from the HSCA acoustic study.
Excuse me. Where's the acoustics coming from? Where is the acoustics coming from?
It is coming from a motorcycle. I'll explain that in just a minute.
Okay.
It's addictive though.
Yeah. But if you could hold your questions to the end, unless it's really critical. And okay, that's going to loop until we do this. Okay. This is for CBS now.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
This is for CBS, and the Delta Fragment was a large fragment of skull which was recovered from the trunk of the limousine. ITEC looked for particulate matter coming from his head. They failed to know that there were 5 fragments recovered. They only identified 4, and they came exclusively from the front of the president's head. And it is a simple process of elimination to realize that the Delta Fragment arose from the back. Here's their tracking of 2 fragments which were ejected out of the limousine and were recovered in Dealey Plaza, and 2 smaller ones that went down into the limo. And we're going to see here that one of the most iconic moments, that density, that right past her right glove is part of that fragment. I'll show you that much better because we can actually track it. It was recovered from the rear seat, taken to the autopsy room, x-rayed. It was determined to have a portion of an exit wound in one corner, and every review panel has agreed that this has an exit wound, but they put it in the wrong place. They should have watched the film. And we see Jackie, and if you watch Clint Hill here, he pushes it forwards to her, and he loses his balance in the process. We can compare the two. There's the x-ray, there's the fragment. 4 out the front, 1 later out the back. And there's anatomic landmarks which can fit with this. And Jacqueline Kennedy described this, but her testimony was removed from the Warren Commission about this. A few years ago in 2001, Sobel went in, looked at the transcript reporter's notes, and found what she said. She described it in excruciating detail. It was wedge-shaped. It had little ridges. Those little ridges are a portion of the sagittal suture where your bones come together. There is only one anatomic alignment which will fit, and we've seen it on the film already. Okay? That's just another extra portion of evidence that it came from the top rear of the head. We know it didn't come from the front because 4 of them came out the front, and you can't have an extra one fit in there. So back then, CBS should have known that there were 5 fragments, and everybody knew that Jackie was going on the trunk for one of those. Now, here's the second part. ITEC studied the head motion. It was their conclusion that 2 separate forces acted upon the president's head, first from behind, the second from the front. Spaced, the impact spaced approximately 1/10 of a second, 1/9 of a second apart, 2 Zapruder frames. Forward, backward. 2 separate forces. Okay? Here we go, forwards and backwards. It's very quick, but it is identifiable and quantifiable, and ITEC did it for us. And you can see after the first shot, there is no perturbation in the back of his head. Nothing has moved, nothing has come out. It's only after the second shot that we see the ejection of the Delta Fragment onto the trunk of the limousine from the force of the second shot from the front. So, CBS News knew that 2 forces acted in opposite directions. The only forces in Dealey Plaza acting that day with sufficient force to affect these motions was bullets. Here's the single bullet theory. They analyzed and quantified the motion of Kennedy and Connolly's hands as they were emerging from behind the sign. They said that Kennedy was already voluntarily reacting to a wound at the time that John Connolly was hit. The dotted line there is Connolly's hand going up, and then the rapid downward movement is that pulling of his arm down to his side. And this is from the ITEC study. As we've seen before, JFK is already reacting even before Connolly is hit. And by the way, Jackie is turned to her right to look at him before that time. Connolly testified that he had turned to his right in response to the first shot that hit Kennedy. So the single bullet theory is a fantasy. It was a political machination to get out of the problem of only 3 shells being found in the 6th floor, when in actuality 5 bullets were found. And again, this is just the upward involuntary motion of Connolly's hand that we see. His hat flips up, his lapel flaps as well, but I think that's from this hat turning it out as it's drug up like that, because the hand motion is indirect. Oh, I will. And delayed down. I guess I can describe this faster than this video, but that's okay. So both men were struck by different bullets. That in and of itself should tell us there was a conspiracy, but we can do much, much more. And there was where his wrist was. We've seen that before. And of course, the only bullet from behind that fragmented significantly was the shot to Kennedy's head. And a fragment of that bullet was caused Connolly's wrist to go forwards. The Dallas doctors testified they thought it was a fragment of a bullet that had caused Connolly's wrist wound, and not a whole pristine bullet as we have in CE 399, the so-called magic bullet that was found on a stretcher in Parkland Hospital. So, from 3 different sources, CBS has known for 39 years that there was evidence of conspiracy, if they wanted to identify it or acknowledge it. But they continue to deny it. They'll put on specials. They'll try to do alignments, and we'll let you, got cards or whatever, but go to jfkproject.org. This whole subject will be detailed much more precisely, much more detailed than I'm going to present here today.
What about the Harper fragment? Is that
Can
included
we,
in the file?
can we wait till?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay, now, what I have is I've got a photographic documentation of the events as they occurred in the Zapruder film, filmed at 18.5 frames per second, or roughly 1/19th of a second per frame. We can see the voluntary and involuntary reactions of people on the film. Involuntary reactions can be from an immediate impact, which is direct, immediate. Usually the next frame will see it. There is an involuntary startle reaction to a loud sound, which will cause people to jerk a little bit. That occurs approximately 1.5 to 2 Zapruder frames, or 1/10 of a second after the sound is heard. And I'll have some examples of this in just a second. And of course, voluntary reactions are conscious reactions that you make in response to a stimulus, and at the minimum they should take 4 to 5 Zapruder frames, or 1/4 of a second. But you can see whatever type of reaction we are going to identify, it's going to be within 1/4 of a second or 1/10 of a second or less. Here is a guy getting shot in the face. You'll see the immediate reaction of his jaw getting turned around, and then he voluntarily moves away. So that's a direct impact, okay? I'll show it to you once more, but it's just obvious that, you know, you get shot with a bullet, you're going to move real fast, okay? I'm sorry, we're not at a round concert. Now, this is an involuntary. Watch his arms go down. When he hears it, he doesn't know. This is a classic startle reaction. And we're going to see that with Abraham Zapruder as he does his film. See? Okay, you get the idea. Now, in case anyone here doesn't know, and I'll just fill you in, this is a Aero Photo Dealey Plaza. The motorcade came down through Main Street, turned onto Houston, then they made the sharp turn onto Elm Street. That's the journey of the motorcade. And in that motorcade was a motorcycle policeman by the name of McLean, who had his microphone stuck in the on position. He recorded the events that day as they occurred. This was a continuous recording. And unfortunately, the best quality or the best accuracy we can get is by using the film, which is about 1/19th of a second for each frame, which is still good, but that limits us because we don't know exactly when, whether the shutter was open, when it was closed, when exactly the bullet happened to hit during that time period. But it's continuous, the tape is, and the film, we can see everything we need to. And McLean trailed all the way through, recorded everything, and I'll show you there's another short video of his transit. There should be no question that it was McLean's microphone that recorded this. It was not recorded at the Trade Mart. It was not recorded a minute later. It was recorded in Dealey Plaza as the events occurred. Here's the presidential limo. That's the Dow Tex building. That's going to be a very important building for us to take note of. The TSBD, Texas State School Book Depository, is across the street. I should have pointed that out on the previous one, but we'll have a chance to see it. So there's his position on the Hughes film, just as the motor came. Now here, if you watch very quickly, you'll see a quick white streak going across there. And if you watch the lower arrow, you'll see, and I've got a slower version of it that I'll show you later, but I identified him on Elm Street, or Houston Street, after meticulous calculations. Here's McLean. This was taken by Malcolm Couch just seconds after the assassination. He's on the motorcycle there. So we've got him coming into Dealey Plaza. We got him on the multiple films after the assassination. That was the Malcolm Couch film. Then there was the Bond film, which shows him right there. So certainly there were other motorcyclists there, but we know from the mathematics that he was the only one who could have recorded those sounds from his position. It had to be him alone who recorded the gunfire. Those circles are the estimated position of the motorcycle as it made its way, journey through the plaza due to the HSCA experts, acoustic experts. There should be no question that he's the guy who recorded this. Now here's the slow version of that film. And it took me a long, long time to do this, but when I knew that the calculations were correct, I knew he had to be there. Now if you watch the red arrow, it will darken and you'll just see his front wheel of his motorcycle between the legs of bystanders right now. You see that up there just above the red arrow?
Yeah.
That is the front wheel of his motorcycle. Now if you watch it this time, you can watch the white streak, which is his helmet. It moves horizontally at a regular pace, and the distance between the front wheel and the position of his motorcycle helmet, we can compare to the other motorcycles, and it's the right distance that we should. His head was about shoulder length because when you sit on a motorcycle, you crouch down. And that's why it's so hard. You can just see him obscuring things or being obscured as it makes its way through at that point. So we've got him coming in, we've got him, and this is very important because this right about there is the exact time that the first shot was received by his microphone. So from there, I start my calculations. And the one thing about it is that once we have him identified at that spot, there's only about 1.2 seconds, something like that, between the first shot and the second shot. At 11 miles per hour, he only moved 16 feet, which is a very small distance. It's not really going to affect the calculations. For the second shot, we know, as I said, it's only going to be 14, 16 feet. For the third and fourth shots, the two head shots, they come from different directions. We can triangulate his position because in the quarter of a second that those two impulses were received, he traveled 4 feet. So you can basically triangulate his position. The last shot was taken about 0.8, 0.9 seconds after the head shots. And again, he's only moved a small thing. So as far as my calculations go, once I've got him seen and identified on the film precisely where he's at one time, it's pretty easy to calculate the other positions. Now, the amazing thing about this is that the HSCA acoustic experts had absolutely no idea when anyone was hit except for the head wound back in 1978. When they made their predictions here, or not predictions, but actually what they discovered, they couldn't game the system. They couldn't say, oh, well, we know that Connolly was hit here, so we're going to look for some impulses and say when. No, they had no idea. And if they had listened to the medical experts back then, they would have believed that Kennedy and Connolly were hit by the same bullet. Okay? And we will find out that with astonishing accuracy, they were able to identify every one of these, including a backfire, by the way. They knew it wasn't a gunshot, but we'll see, as we have seen, that backfire was what Rosemary Willis was responding to. It wasn't a gunshot. And they, I can tell you, they were not meticulous enough to read all this stuff, the eyewitness evidence, to have her testimony in their minds when they said, oh yeah, we think there's a backfire back there. Here's McLean on Houston again. No, you don't need to see that. Now, let me just pause this for a second. The one thing I want to do is, I didn't do this alone, okay? I'm a diagnostic radiologist. I know some forensic pathology. I know some forensic anthropology. I'm not an expert in acoustics. I'm not an expert in ballistics. But what I've done is simply taken the government's own data to arrive at my conclusions. I have added nothing to this except my opinion and my analysis and logic as to what happened. Now, in 1994, about 16 years after the HSCA committee, Dr. John Latimer identified that rapid movement of John Connolly's wrist. So we knew, excuse me, exactly when someone was hit. And guess what? That started the synchronization, because I've got 2 points, the head shots and Connolly's chest shots, and we've got the times, and we can say, let's compare one to the other and see if it actually fits. And what we found out is that it does. And we know the speed of bullets, excuse me, and we know from forensics the path of the bullet that it was shot from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. It was shot at frame 221, or 140.32 seconds on the tape. And the one thing about my calculations that no one has done who's attempted to do this is you have to realize that the shot impulse time is not when the shot was fired, it's only when the acoustic wave from that shot reached his microphone. So what we do is I calculate backwards. I know where McLean is. I can know the distance to the TSBD. I say, okay, when in time did that shot originate? I calculate to back, and this turns out to be 0.0. I'll show the calculations on the next frame. I go calculate back to when it started, and then I take the speed of bullets as best I could find them from the Edgewood Army Arsenal test, and calculate when it would hit the limo. Well, comes out to 223, just like John Latimer said. And here it is. I don't want to dwell on this because if you go to my website, I've got all of these distances here, and I have nothing to hide. If anyone wants to do the math again, they're more than welcome to. If they find I'm wrong, they can prove me wrong. No one has been able to do so yet, and I seriously doubt that anyone ever will. But anyway, when we go through the calculations, we find out he was struck at frame 223, just as we see on the Zapruder film, and just the exact distance we've calculated from the tape. And again, I won't dwell on this again, but we know there was an involuntary reaction of Connolly and then a voluntary reaction of Connolly due to this gunshot. And here again, we can see it clear. Jackie has already turned to look at her husband. She's heard a shot. Connolly has already turned to his right because he heard a shot. But they didn't hear the shot that hit Connolly because the bullet travels faster than sound. And if we could see Nellie because she did the same thing, okay? They were not mistaken as the Warren Commission thought. They gave exact and correct eyewitness testimony. Here's the motion of JFK's arms right as he comes out from behind the TSBD. I mean the sign. Now, we have 2 shots from behind, both of which could not have been fired from the same rifle because the Mannlicher Carcano takes about 2.5 seconds to cycle through. It's manually operated. So, if a second shot was fired from the TSBD, where did the first shot come from? Well, the forensics show that all of the shots fired from behind came from left to right as we look at this next picture here. And there's only one building in Dealey Plaza which offers that trajectory, and that is the Dow Tex building. And here is this famous 6th floor window where 2 shots were fired, the 2nd and the 5th shots. And here's a picture taken just after the first couple shots with an open window on the 2nd floor of the Dow Tex building. This was the origin of 2 of the other shots from behind. Okay, now I'm kind of going backwards here, but this is just how we're going to do it. We know the calculations from the head shot to Conley synchronize. Well, let's see if the shot from Conley to Kennedy synchronizes and when he was hit. Do the same process. McLean's there. We go backwards to the. Actually, you know what? That is wrong. That is wrong. Because it should be from the TSBD. I mean, from the Dow Tex building. The first shot was from the Dow Tex building. The next thing does have the correct math, but when you turns out when I do the calculations, it comes out to frame 202. I'm off by 1/19th of a second. It keeps me up at night. Okay, I can tell you. I don't know why, but it's off by 1 frame, and I have yet to find out why. But it does not in any way stop me from drawing my conclusions, because I'm only off by 1/19th of a second in the end of it all. Now, there was another, if you remember that list, you probably don't, but there was another impulse they found at 137.70 seconds, which correlates to about frame 173. No one reacts. There's multiple people who took pictures, which timestamp when they took their picture, because we can find out from the Zapruder film, say, okay, what's happening here, what's happening here. We can say this photo was taken at frame X, 202 or 203, and nothing happens then. The acoustic experts knew when they analyzed this tape that they might have some what we call false positives. That's when nothing happened, but you say something happened. This, I believe, is an example of a false positive. I can't completely rule out a shot, but I see no evidence that anyone heard it, or no evidence that it struck anything or caused any damage. Now, we have to look at the headshots, and there's an asterisk there, you might notice. Weiss and Ashkenazi were the ones who tried to do an echolocation, and those spikes that extend above the dotted line there are thought to represent first the muzzle blast, the large muzzle blast from the thing, and then a series of echoes that came off the buildings as that sound wave propagated, bounced off, and came to McLean's microphone. But there's a problem with that, and they said there was a 95% probability that there was one shot to the head from the grassy knoll. Now, it makes absolutely no sense, because we know his head goes forwards and then backwards. The famous JFK Oliver Stone, back and to the left. Well, it was forwards and then back and to the left, not just back and to the left. And it makes no sense. And so when I started looking at this, I haven't told you yet, but there was another group that looked at it before Weiss and Ashkenazi, and that was Dr. Barger and the group from BBN. And they had found another shot a quarter of a second later. Before Weiss and Ashkenazi did their study, they said, well, we think it came from the grassy knoll a quarter second later. Well, they compromised. They said, well, we believe all these pulses are just one string from the first shot. That was their mistake. And here's the synchronization. There's things about the conclusion of a single shot from the grassy knoll at 144.9 that don't make sense. One of which is it doesn't synchronize with the previous shot, because when we do the math, it only goes to 85.5 frames. We know that there's an 89 or 90 frame difference between 312 and 223. It doesn't synchronize in that dimension. And if we try to synchronize it to the following shot, it comes out too late, okay? And the windshield has already started flaring before calculations show that bullet would have hit. So it doesn't synchronize, and it points in the wrong direction. So something was wrong. And what I did was, I came to the conclusion real quickly. I was thinking 144.9, 145.15. How is it that when these guys are looking at these pulses at millisecond levels, that all of a sudden they would change the time of a shot by 250 of those milliseconds? And I came to the conclusion, 2 movements of the head, we've got 2 separate shots, both identified by different independent groups. And then you can do the calculations. And this is the diagrams. This is correct this time. I'm sorry about that. But, McLean's there. We do the shot at 144.9 from the Dow Tex building, and the shot at 145.15 from the grassy knoll. And guess what? Shot impact time is calculated out to 1/10 of a second, or 2 Zapruder frames, just as the iTech Corporation had told us 2 separate forces acted upon his head. And as I just said before, those were bullets. That's the only forces in Dealey Plaza that could affect that motion. And as I mentioned before, it goes back to frame 223 exactly, as we knew from the film. And when we go forwards, it shows a 1.9 frame difference, 312, 313 forwards, 314, 315 backwards, 2 frame difference. It matches. That's synchronization. Now here, I'll just show you again. And if you watch that grass, see the dark edge of the grass? You can see his head going down below it, and then you'll see it come back up above it, okay? Down and forward, back and up. 2 separate forces, 2 directions, 2 assassins. And iTech, CIA contractor, did the work for us. And they told CBS this very same thing 39 years ago.
Question? So they're saying that there were 2 forces, but did
Excuse-
they at the time identify 2 bullets?
No, they didn't. And there have been, I'll answer it. But there have been theories because and we'll get to that in just a moment. But the medical evidence, no one knew or was able to determine that there were 2 gunshot wounds to the head. And since there was only 1 gunshot wound to the head from behind by the medical panels, they had to come up with reactions like, oh, it's a reverse jet effect, where the material that was blasted out whipped his head backwards, okay, which can happen, but it's only with highly liquid substances. You need that shock wave to be gone through a liquid substance to do that. And even if it had occurred, we would have seen it on the first frame and not 2 frames later. The other one is a neuromuscular reaction of some bizarre type, which only affected the muscles which were involved in yanking his head backwards at a very rapid velocity. We don't see his back arching, we don't see his legs flying. Those 2 answers are just absolutely untenable. Now here is my complete calculations. All the distances, all the speed of bullets. There's a few small, very small adjustments I make for a difference in the muzzle blast. It takes 1/100th of a second for that acoustic wave to actually start. I've added this in here, but for simplification I just left it out. But as I said, it's here for the world to see. Anybody can take a calculator, compare it. I have no fear, okay? No fear whatsoever. Are these measurements perfect? No, they're not. But they're perfect enough to get us within that 1 Zapruder frame that we know that that's the best we can do. And everything synchronizes. Now, you mentioned the head wounds, and we're going to get to that now. And this is where my journey started in this. And that is, these are the post-mortem skull x-rays of JFK. Now, by radiological conveyance, right and left are reversed. So the left side of that picture is the right side of JFK's head, and that piece of metal there fits up at the top rear over there. It took me a long time, and I feel really stupid about it. But I finally, and let me just move over here so there's no question. I finally identified this fracture. Down low, and this is very significant because the autopsy doctors who were there the night of the autopsy had been telling the House Select Committee pathologists that the bullet came in low, the bullet came in low. They wouldn't believe them. And no one, radiologist, had described this fracture prior to me doing so, or noted its significance. And it's very significant because it is the crucial point that allows me to determine that he was struck twice in the head. And now we'll go to another view. This was the drawing made for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and this is what caught me, was I said, wow, they left that fracture out. Why did they do that? And then it came to me, oh, that's where the autopsy doctor said a bullet entered. Now, how can I determine whether that was made by a bullet and whether it was made first or made second? You know, how do we do that? Well, there's a principle in forensic pathology which was done at the beginning of last century, and it's called Papa's Law. And what it states is that a secondary fracture will have its propagating fractures stopped by a pre-existing fracture. And we see this in glass here on the right-hand side. We can tell that the impact on the left-hand side was made secondarily because it doesn't cross that first fracture because there was a pre-existing gap. We have the same pattern in JFK skull x-ray there. The arrow points to the lower fracture. This is on the left side of his head, by the way, stopping the propagation of that upper fracture. And the bullet that entered down low, and it had to enter down low because that fracture was made first, did not turn around and come out the back of his head. It was the two shots from the two motions and the two acoustic impulses we have on the tape. It all fits, okay? And that's where the multiple review panels made their mistake. No other radiologist had mentioned this fracture or known its significance, and at the even more so, none of them even knew about Papa's Law. In fact, I developed Papa's Law on my own, just mentally thought it through, and then I presented this to Cyril Wecht, who's a noted forensic pathologist who was on the lone dissenting opinion on the HSCA panel. And when I presented to him, he says, oh yeah, we've known that for a long time, Randy. It's called Papa's Law. And I was floored. I just thought, you guys knew this all along. Anyway, here's the 5 shots from 3 spots where they hit. It all synchronizes. And again, let me emphasize, the acoustic experts, they made their mistake and about the headshots. But beyond that, they had 1 false positive, but they got everything else down to 1/100th of a second accuracy without knowing when any of those shots occurred, possibly except the headshot. And no one knew that there was a double headshot at that time. Okay? So you have to